What's up, dudes? Let's have a look at this visitor design pattern. In this example, let's assume that we work for a data analytics company and we've been hired by the Texas Rangers baseball team to assess a player's wins above replacement. Now, WAR is a real stat used in baseball. It attempts to quantify the number of wins that a player contributes to his team, because that's what it's all about, right? How many games does your team win because of you? So what we want to do is determine the number of wins that a player is worth compared to his replacement. And theoretically, a team could use our info to determine whether or not they should replace this player. Alright, the visitor design pattern is a behavioral design pattern. It's useful when we want to perform an operation on a group of similar objects. Now, in this case, the similar objects will be baseball player objects. And we're going to move all of the operational logic for this program into a single class. That class will be the concrete implementation of this baseball sabermetrics visitor interface. Now, we're going to come back to this. We'll leave it blank for now, but first, let's take a look at the classes that our visitor will be visiting. So for that, I have created a visitable package. Within this package, I've already created 3 different classes to represent the objects. We've got a catcher, a first baseman, and a shortstop. We've also got an interface, so let's take a look at that. Now, this visitable interface is going to be implemented by our baseball player classes, and this tells us that these classes are eligible to be visited by our visitor object. We're only going to define a single method within this interface, and we're going to call it accept. I don't know why I typed a method there. We're going to return a double, and it's going to be called accept. Accept what? Well, it accepts a visitor, as you could probably guess. Okay, next, let's take a look at our baseball player classes. So first, let's take a look at shortstop. Now, I've already defined a couple properties here. We've got a name for the player and a batting average for the player, and then I've got some basic getters and setters here. Okay, that's not the interesting part. Here's the interesting part. So we want to let this class implement our player visitable interface. That tells us that this object can be visited by our visitor class. So we'll implement this method. And here is the cool part. So all we need to do here is we say return visitor dot visit. Now we haven't created this visit method yet, so it's going to be red, but that's fine. And then we pass in a reference to this class. So this keyword here, of course, refers to this class. So let's take a look at what's happening here. This class accepts, right? It accepts a visitor object. That visitor object then calls its visit method, passing in a reference to the class that it's visiting. That's pretty cool, right? So it passes in a reference to this class, and then the operational logic will be within this visit method. So I'm going to copy this because the return value and the syntax will be the exact same for every one of our classes. So let's save this, and we'll take a look at the catcher class. Same properties here, and we'll need to implement that interface. We'll add the method, and we'll do the exact same thing, passing in a reference to this. One last time for the first base class. Add this method. Return visitor.visit this. Alright, so let's close these out. Now let's go back to our visitor interface here. So here we need to define those visit methods. Now we are going to name each one of them visit, and they're all going to return a double. And we're going to achieve this by using method overloading. So we need to pass in a reference to every one of our baseball player objects that we just created. So to save a little time here, I'm just going to copy and paste. And we need one for a catcher. We need one for a first baseman. And that's it. Okay, next we need to implement our concrete class for this interface. So for that, I've already defined a class. We will call it Rangers Visitor Implementation. Now you can see how this could be useful for other teams as well. If another team wanted to implement this same interface, it certainly could, and it could use different logic in evaluating a player's WAR. So here we want to let this implement our sabermetrics visitor interface. We will add these methods. Now here's where we determine the logic for how we figure out a player's WAR. Now in reality, this can be a pretty complicated formula, so we're going to keep this very simple. And we're going to determine a player's WAR simply by getting his batting average, and we're going to subtract it from the league average for that position. Now I've actually looked up some medians for last year, and for shortstop it looks like it was 266. So that was the league median, and we'll assume for the Rangers that their replacement player for shortstop, say their replacement for their starting shortstop, would bat 80% of the league average. Okay? So that's what we use to determine that player's WAR. Now we'll do the same thing for this catcher. We'll take his batting average. The league average for a catcher was 243. And it needs to go in these parentheses. And we'll assume that the replacement will bat 80% of that as well. And you can probably figure out what I'm going to do here. Same exact thing. Alright, and the first baseman was 242. So we'll assume our replacement bats 80% of the league average. Alright, so we've got all of our methods defined. You see the red has gone away from these classes. Next, let's test this thing out. So for that, I've created a test package, and we've got a test visitor class. Let's just put all of this in the main method. Now, I'm going to create a decimal format object here. This isn't part of the visitor design pattern at all, but this will format it when we print it to the screen so it looks a little more readable. So let's just do it let's do it like that. All right, now let's create a reference to our visitor object. So we'll just call it visitor. And we're using the Rangers implementation. Okay, next what we'll do is we'll create an array, and this will represent our baseball player object. So for that, we create an array for our interfaces, and we'll just call this players. And we'll define a little array here. So let's pass in a shortstop in the name of Andrus, and we'll give him a batting average of let's say 232. We'll pass in a catcher, and we'll give him a name of Mathis and a batting average, let's say of 181. Let's say he had a rough year, and I think Mathis actually did have a pretty rough year. And next, let's pass in a reference to our first baseman, and we'll call him Guzman. And we'll give him, let's say he had a pretty good year. Let's give him a batting average of 323. It's not so bad. Now, in reality, a good WAR would be anywhere between 4 and 5. You would be a very good baseball player, but the WAR can be any number. It doesn't have to be an integer. It can be a double, hence the double return values in this. So in order to test this out, let's use a simple for each loop. And let's call this player, and we'll iterate through our players array. And we will print this out using our format object. And the way that we handle this is we simply take the player object, we call its accept method, and we pass in this visitor object that we just created here. All right, so before I run this, I actually want to add a couple of things to our baseball player objects here. So just so we can see what's going on, let's go ahead and print out that player's name, and we'll say this player's WAR is whatever it is. So I'm just going to copy and paste this real quick. I'm going to put the exact same thing in every one of these classes. every one of our baseball player object classes, that is. All right, so back to our test. Okay, now let's do one more thing here. Let's put each one of these on a new line. So what we should see printed out is the name of the player, just a string reference to the WAR, and then the WAR itself will be formatted right here and printed out. Let's take a look. Okay, so that's what we got. We can see that the WAR for our shortstop is between 0 and 1, which means, he's not that good of a player, basically. This player is less than 1, so the team might actually consider replacing the catcher, which was Mathis, with the replacement based on our calculation here. And for the first baseman, it's between 0 and 1 as well. So again, this isn't exactly how a real baseball team would calculate WAR, but that's not the point. The point is to see the benefits of this visitor design pattern. So let's go over that again just very, very quickly. So in our interface here, we defined our visit methods using method overloading. That allows us to pass in to keep the exact same call here for each one of our classes, where we simply call a visit class and we pass in a reference to the object that is being visited. All right, that is it for this. Let's take a look at the programming question that I have got assigned for everybody. So assume that you work for a data analytics company. You've probably heard that before. And you're being hired by an NFL team to grade draft prospects. So they need you to help them figure out who they want to draft. Use any grading scale you want to use. You can say 0 to 100 for a player. Or you can say you can grade a player using the letter system. So if you want to give them A through F. And use any algorithm that you would like to determine that player's grade. All right. Thanks, guys.